Velkommen alle sammen, og jeg kan jo lige starte med, mens de sidste sætter sig, og I'll be speaking English in a little while, don't worry, this is not in Danish.
Good.
But just for a quick start, vil jeg lige gøre opmærksom på, at vi den 16. maj kl. 16 har et seminar om økonomisk frihed og populisme. Når der kommer populister til, fører det så til faldende økonomisk frihed. Er utilfredshed med kapitalismen årsag til populisme? Sådan nogle spørgsmål der. Vi har Andreas Berg, som er docent ved Lunds Universitet og forsker ved Institut for Næringslivsforskning. Vi har Robert Clemmensen, professor i komparativ politik ved Lunds Universitet. Vi har Solbjørg Jacobsen, medlem af Folketinget for Liberal Alliance. Og vi har Christian Bjørnskov, professor i økonomi ved Aarhus Universitet. Og medlem af CEPOS bestyrelse som oplægsholder. Og det er altså den 16. maj kl. 16, som man kan tilmelde sig. Det håber I vil gøre. And now I'll switch into English. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Dalibor, for flying into Copenhagen. It's the 27th of April. It doesn't feel like it. It's very, very cold. Believe me, sometimes it's warmer, but it's great to have you here. We are going to be discussing some very, very important topics here today. Dalibor Rohac has written a fascinating book, which is the sort of direct reason why we're having this conversation about this topic. It's called Governing the EU in an Age of Division. I finished reading it a few days ago. It's a great read. It's very interesting. Congratulations. We have 10 copies of the book available for sale. And the price is 450 Danish kroner, which is very, very cheap because it's about 700 Danish kroner on Amazon. A very expensive book.
It is. I mean, I have to say that the publisher really put me in a bind here because they said that if this version sells well, then they'll produce a paperback for a wider audience. So that's where I need you to work with me and be ready to make some minor financial sacrifices.
But anyway, we have it for sale here for 450 Danish kroner. There's 10 copies over there. Actually, there's 9. I've got the 10th because the only version I had was an electronic. But you can buy this one as well. Same price. We won't call it used because I've been sitting with it like this. So, Dalibor, thank you very much for joining us here in Copenhagen. We'll be discussing the future of the European Union and your vision for a decentralized European Union. Let me first present Dalibor Rohac. He is Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, in the USA. He has a PhD in Political Economy from King's College in London and economics degrees from St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford, George Mason University, and Charles University in Prague. But you're not Czech, you're Slovakian of origin. You're now an American.
That's right.
Yes.
Recovering Eastern European.
So congratulations. When did you become a U.S. citizen?
Oh, in 2020.
2020. Yep. So it's pretty recent. Okay. Let's start a little bit on. I mean, Slovakia shares a border with the Ukraine.
Slovakia does share a border with Ukraine, and Slovakia is also headed into a parliamentary election later this year. And I think much of the current policy consensus hangs in the balance there. So Slovakia, like its neighbors, most importantly Poland, has been very active in trying to help Ukraine. Most recently, Slovakia delivered its entire fleet of Soviet-made MiG-29 fighters to Ukraine. But that policy consensus in favor of Ukraine is very fragile given the state of public opinion in the country. And there is not an unreasonable fear that Slovakia might follow the path of Hungary after the election.
So what's going on there? Why is Slovakia so different from Poland?
It is. I mean, it is a very hard thing to explain. But very consistently, when you look at polling in Slovakia, Slovak population is significantly more pro-Russian than say the Poles. I mean, Slovak public opinion resembles on these matters perhaps public opinion in Bulgaria. Okay. I think it stems partly from a sort of latent sense of sort of anti-Americanism, which might date back to the US-led intervention in Kosovo, which was sort of attacked at the time by the political opposition on sort of almost pan-Slavic grounds, sort of saying that we should not be assisting in a sort of war waged against our Slavic brethren, and you really had some very sort of irresponsible leadership from some political quarters that I think helped sort of entrench kind of anti-American, anti-Western sentiments in a way that I think might prove quite damaging in the months to come.
So that's worrying from a sort of foreign and security policy perspective. What about the internal politics of and the institutions of liberal democracy? Are they under threat in Slovakia?
I don't want to be overly alarmist. I mean, there are important differences between the Hungarian situation and the Slovak one. For one, it is very hard to imagine a future government, any future government, that would not be a coalition government. So that already poses some sort of checks and balances on the power of the executive and the ability of a Viktor Orbán-like leader to entrench themselves. So that is not a direct risk. At the same time, I mean, the Slovaks went through this initial burst of reforms and sort of significant improvements in their business environment, rule of law, fighting corruption, around the time when we were joining the European Union. And since then, I think a certain sort of complacency has set in. There has been significant brain drain. I mean, there is a reason why I'm living in Washington and not in Bratislava. And the risk is that that sort of stasis and stagnation will sort of continue and make it harder for Slovaks to catch up with more advanced economies to our west.
Okay.
There's already a gap opening, pretty significant one between Slovakia and say the Czech Republic.
I was just going to say that you would expect the Czech Republic to be a sort of example to follow. That it would be very hard to do worse than the Czechs without sort of trying to think, why is this going on? Why aren't we doing as well? And how can we copy them?
It is an interesting question. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you have lots of Slovaks that emigrated to the Czech Republic de facto. I mean, there is no language barrier to speak of. Even before the EU accession, there have been no sort of legal restrictions for Slovak citizens to come and work and study, etc., in the Czech Republic, and so it boils down to the willingness of people to use voice or exit in sort of influencing matters in their own country, and paradoxically, using exit does not necessarily put the pressure on governments to do better. Rather, they politicians face a sort of smaller and then sort of demobilized electorate as a result. Which seems to be the dynamic.
So I guess that's a good segue to our main topic, because that's all about.
All right. Oops. So can everybody hear me all right? Great. You were saying?
Yes, I'll just take it from the front, because we'll cut this out of the podcast, which will be the main number of listeners for this. Imagine 2,000 people sitting in this room.
Wonderful. That's not daunting at all.
So I guess that's a good segue to the main topic of our conversation, which is your vision for revitalizing the European Union, both in a political sense, but also from an economic perspective. So the title of your book is Governing the EU in an Age of Division, and the way I read it, you're critical of the aim of and of the dogma of ever closer union of the European Union, and you speak for a more decentralized approach to European integration. Could you say a little bit more about what your criticism is about, why you're critical, and what you aim to propose instead for the European Union?
Okay, I think that's a sort of fair summary of the main argument. So what I do at a sort of abstract conceptual level is to show that there really are two different sort of sets of lenses through which one can look at the European project. One can either see the EU and the integration project as an actual project aiming towards a goal, trying to move Europeans to a certain destination, the ever closer union, or one can see the European Union as an order existing at a point in time in sort of space, both geographic space and a sort of abstract space. And I think those two sets of lenses, or these two views of the EU, are in a tension that has not been always very well sort of negotiated or addressed. And the project itself has been traditionally very heavily tilted towards the view of the EU as a project, as something in the making. I mean, you know, when you talk to people in the Brussels bubble, so-called, they would tell you that.
And you've lived there for a while.
I actually never lived in Brussels. I mean, but I was in Brussels 2 days ago, presenting the book.
But you've been working for a Brussels-based.
I have an affiliation with the Martens Center, which is the official think tank of the European People's Party.
Yes, okay.
In Brussels, and so they kindly invited me to a nice panel with Klaus Welle, of all people, the former chief of staff of Manfred Weber and the author of the Spitzenkandidaten system. So next to Klaus Welle, I really looked like an arch Eurosceptic. Next day in London, meeting some of my Brexiter friends, I suddenly became a Euro-federalist of sorts. Really, not being particularly at ease with either of those two groups. So the approach that has been taken by sort of dominant political forces on the center right and center left has been one of sort of approaching the challenge of European integration as really sort of, you know, building a future federal state, and you can see that in the various sort of institutional changes and policies that have been adopted over time, which have rarely been justified on either procedural legitimacy grounds or output legitimacy grounds. More often than not, they were justified by the promise of the good things that await us at the destination. Right, the euro was created at the time when all economists on the left, on the right, agreed that the eurozone did not fit the definition of an optimum currency area. It didn't have a system of fiscal transfers, didn't have enough flexibility, didn't have enough labor mobility between its constituent parts. Yet the euro was sort of introduced in the hope that it would become necessary to complete the architecture of the monetary union eventually, by building in a system of fiscal transfers or having much closer integration of European economies as a result. The European Parliament, when it was turned into a directly elected body in the 1970s, I don't think responded necessarily to a sort of pre-existing Europeanization of political life. And to this day, political life in Europe is obstinately national. This system was set up, and the Spitzenkandidaten system was set up with the explicit purpose of sort of moving Europeans towards a sort of more Europeanized, more sort of homogenized form of political life.
So create. There was no European public, but creating the parliament, which you normally say you need a European public for that to make sense, but you create the parliament in order to create the European public.
I mean, that's in essence the basic idea of the salami method, advanced by Jean Monnet famously, that you start cooperating or with integration in sort of small number of policy areas where it's feasible, in the hope that it will beget more and more cooperation over time and make it inevitable for the European project to sort of move towards that desired destination. It fueled a political culture of total optimism, as Domenico Maggione, the great Italian political scientist, calls it. That always these sort of leaps into the dark were sort of taken under sort of most optimistic, sunniest assumptions about what will happen next. And the point I make in the book is that rather than sort of directly sort of criticizing this view, I mean, it's perfectly reasonable view to have that we ought to be moving towards a European federal state. I mean, it's not necessarily my view, but it's not a sort of crazy ambition, but clearly that ambition runs into constraints imposed by, I mean, Europe's heterogeneous realities. I mean, Europe has always been a very unwieldy, decentralized continent. My colleague at AEI, Jesus Fernandez Villaverde, who teaches at UPenn, has a wonderful paper with his co-authors that looks at Europe's geography and the sort of essentially the fragmented nature of land, including arable land and the sort of land masses that go through the continent, that make it very difficult to sort of to politically centralize Europe. So it's not a coincidence to my mind that in the past, I mean, Europe has been traditionally governed through very complex, unwieldy governance structures. I mean, epitomized by the likes of the Holy Roman Empire, or my personal favorite, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And maybe moving closer to the present, Europe's diversity, heterogeneity is a fact of life, and it has only increased with the Eastern enlargements following 2004, 2007, and the following ones. And I think, from where I come from, I mean, those enlargements have been a terrific success. I mean, you really have 100 million people in Eastern Europe living in democracy, living in a free market economy, notwithstanding questions we might have about democratic backsliding in some countries. But I mean, it's very easy to sort of see what the counterfactuals are. In 1990, Poland and Ukraine had the same real per capita GDP. Before the war, Poland was, in 2022, 2021, Poland was 3 times as wealthy in real terms as Ukraine, and so big part of the story of Polish success has been its EU membership and its sort of part in the single market and its place in these international supply chains that have relocated to Poland. Yet there is still a gap between both the East and the West, economically speaking. Notwithstanding the catch-up growth, there is a massive gap between many old members as well. And in fact, there is very little convergence among the old EU 15 member states. If anything, there is in fact divergence on some important economic metrics. If you look at total factor productivity, you have negative rates of growth of total factor productivity in places like Spain and Italy consistently since the 1990s. Whereas you have countries like Denmark or Sweden or the Netherlands that continue growing and becoming more productive over time.
You have public debt diverging quite a lot. You have some countries increasing that debt. You have some countries that have decreased that debt. I think
that's right, and that sort of diversity, heterogeneity goes beyond just economic measures. I mean, you look at national politics, which is very different in each member state. Since 2019, we have a country in the European Union which is ranked by Freedom House as only partly free, Hungary. That is a challenge in its own right, in my opinion. You look at questions of sort of social attitudes and values, which differ very, very markedly across the EU. On a Pew poll, 88% of Swedes are okay with same-sex marriage. I don't think it's a massively controversial issue in Denmark either. In a place like Hungary or Poland, the support for something like same-sex marriage would be closer to 30%. And so the argument I'm making is that this underlying diversity which exists is a fact of life, and it imposes a constraint on how far the integration process can go. There is indeed a trade-off between how wide the EU is and how deep it can go. And I think it would be foolish to deny the existence of that trade-off. There are things that EU 15 could do that EU 27 can't do, and that certainly EU, once it includes Ukraine, won't be able to do. And I think we have to start, treating Europe as it exists, not as a sort of malleable entity that we can sort of reshape to fit our desires and political ambitions. So that, in a nutshell, is the argument that I propose.
So, in concrete terms, looking at sort of actual policy areas or ambitions of the Commission or the Council, how does this play out? How is it becoming a problem for the kind of integration ambition that we're seeing now, and the approach towards it, that we have this diversity in 27 countries?
I think the way it plays out concretely is that you have, instances of overreach and under-delivery, to put it simply, by the European Union. For example, there were big claims made about the economic benefits to be generated by the euro, and the fact that you will no longer have to face currency exchange related risks, that it would sort of facilitate trade. I think the evidence is 20 years later that the gains from the common currency were very modest in terms of generating new trade and new sort of economic opportunities across Europe. And we can sort of talk more about the other dimensions of having a common currency later. But clearly that hasn't been a sort of massive success story. Neither has it led to that sort of salami method like sort of
convergence.
That too, but also, it didn't. We didn't complement the monetary union with these sort of other institutions that were supposed to materialize. Say through the crisis of 2008 to 2010. People who sort of hoped for a true fiscal union, I think, were disappointed as a result. And you can sort of make similar arguments about.
Would you hope? Did you hope for that? A fiscal union?
I didn't necessarily hope for that, but the logic of that Jean Monnet approach to integration was that it will start with a single currency, and then it will become necessary to complement the common currency with transfers, maybe European taxes, etc., and that just didn't happen. And I think it's still fairly unlikely to sort of materialize anytime soon. You can make similar arguments about, I'm a massive fan of having the Schengen area of passportless travel, but it's kind of difficult to sustain the Schengen area, particularly when faced with border crises in a setting where immigration and asylum policy and border protection is left in the hands of member states, right? And that's what we saw play out in 2015, 2016. With the refugee crisis. Yet it is also very difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a European level immigration and asylum policy, because there are dramatic differences between member states in what they would like that policy to look like. And I think the sort of concatenation of these sort of instances of overreach and under delivery, first of all, erodes trust of people in the European project. And also, creates conflicts. I don't see much compelling rationale for European institutions inserting themselves into many national level debates, particularly when it comes to various questions related to culture wars that are being waged in countries like Hungary and Poland. So I think there is a real risk that the more the EU tries to do of the things that it isn't well positioned to do, that the less member states will pay attention to it, and we'll see a sort of process of gradual hollowing out of European institutions. I mean, we just saw that very recently in Eastern Europe with unilateral import bans imposed on Ukrainian grain by countries like Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary. I mean, totally contrary to EU law, totally sort of outside of any legal framework. We saw something similar with the unilateral border closures at the beginning of the pandemic, where countries just sort of took things into their hands without asking anybody in Brussels for permission, and we kind of sort of pretended that it never happened as later. And so I don't think the real risk. I was here in 2016. We were debating Brexit just a few weeks before the referendum, and I think one lesson of 2016 is.
I think we're discussing Nord Stream as well, weren't we?
Might have been discussing Nord Stream as well. so I think one sort of lesson of that experience.
And that at that time I wasn't particularly interested in that issue. I should have been. You were right. Sorry, go on.
I don't think the real risk facing the EU is that there'll be many other countries trying to follow the British example, but rather that you can end up in a situation in which, I mean, European institutions become less and less relevant. That the real fundamental sort of European public goods that the EU has provided will start fraying around the edges. And then what I have in mind, in particular, are the four freedoms. I mean, to me, the four freedoms are really the living, beating heart of the European project. And if you have
give the listeners the four freedoms, what are they?
Of movement of goods, services, capital, and people.
So basically, the internal market.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's a public good, and maybe we can get back to discussing some of the stuff the EU is doing and subsidiarity.
Mm-hmm.
But let's stick with the sort of main discussion right now. So you're critical of the idea of having a sort of monolithic organization doing a one-size-fits-all policy on 27 countries with this kind of diversity on many different policy areas. But you're saying there are areas where it needs to be done. Is this a Eurosceptic position? Would you call it a Eurosceptic position?
I wouldn't call it a Eurosceptic position. I mean, in 2016 when I was here, I was here to promote my earlier book called Towards an Imperfect Union, a conservative case for the EU. I was trying to show to my friends on the political right, especially in sort of English-speaking world, that there are many things about the European project that they should like. That
you failed in Britain.
I did fail in Britain, but
I'm sorry to point it out.
You do not really know what the counterfactual would have been. I mean, maybe
no, right.
Vote Leave would have won by a landslide instead of 4% if I hadn't written the book. My hope with the book is not to throw stones at the EU or sort of criticize it needlessly. My hope is to help make it relevant and simply make it work better. And I think the condition for that is a sort of acceptance of the fact that the EU is not a superstate in the making, that it should not model itself after sort of ambitious centralist forms of federalism, but rather should sort of try to just sort of embrace the fact that diversity is really a defining feature of the continent. I mean,
okay, so let's get into that. What is it you're proposing instead of the sort of centralized European Union that Brussels is trying to? It fails often, but that it's trying to do right now.
So conceptually, what I propose is to sort of understand that the EU is not one monolithic entity, but it is in reality a bunch of fairly sometimes different integration projects that can run in parallel, and that can also encompass slightly different coalitions of participants. I think there has to be a common core. I mean, I'm certainly not advocating the EU as a sort of free-for-all state of anarchy in which different coalitions can do absolutely whatever they want. To me, I mean, the core principles are really the four freedoms and the sort of integrity of that internal market, which needs to be deepened and strengthened in some important respects. I'm also sort of small c conservative with my proposal, in the sense that I don't think it is terribly likely that we'll see major treaty changes or major sort of a new treaty being written of the sort we saw in the notice with the Constitution for Europe and the Lisbon Treaty. So I basically accept the state of the EU as it is, and I propose that instead of almost exclusively relying on the community method to pursue new policies, I think we should rely far more as Europeans on sort of more flexible approaches that do not necessarily involve each and every member state. I mean, there is in the Lisbon Treaty, there is already a procedure under Article 20 of enhanced cooperation, and actually many of the sort of recent achievements in the European project were sort of done through that method, whether it's European patent, whether it's European divorce law. I mean, PESCO, the defense cooperation, I mean, it's not under Article 20, but it's a de facto intergovernmental arrangement, and not everybody needs to participate, and certainly not everybody participates in all the projects that fall under PESCO. So there is a lot more sort of
Schengen, I guess, is also. I mean, you don't.
I mean, you have Ireland is not part of Schengen, so there already is a degree of sort of picking and choosing, and I think we just have to get accustomed to it, get comfortable with it. I mean, I still need we still need European institutions to particularly ensure that the basic common rules are respected. That's a a very complicated conversation we can sort of get into, but again, like, I'm not advocating a state of anarchy, but I'm advocating perhaps an EU that would put less of an emphasis on the distinction between members and non-members as well. So you could have members that just won't be in the Eurozone, won't be in some parts of the integration project. You have non-members that will be participating in some attributes of the integration project. That already is happening to some extent with Norway, Iceland, etc. Switzerland being part of the single market and an area of passportless travel. And I think with relations to countries like the UK, where we have, I think, a very strong need to keep the UK close, particularly for security and defense purposes, this could sort of more flexible approach could provide a useful way forward. And probably most urgently, I think we need a more creative and more flexible approach to enlargement, because the idea that Ukraine can simply sort of sit back and negotiate for 20 years and then have its accession ratified in 2030 without the French or the Germans chickening out, I don't think that view is tenable. And I think there's a real risk. I mean, there's a real opportunity and a real risk involved in having this dialogue with the Ukrainians. And the risk is that if the expectations that Ukrainians have are disappointed, we might see a sort of anti-European backlash that would be to the detriment of everybody after the war. So what I propose is, let's turn this into a much more piecemeal approach, in which we, maybe we can get Ukrainians already tomorrow into the Erasmus scheme and have Ukrainian students come to European universities and vice versa. Maybe, it's a much simpler process for Ukraine to join the single market prior to joining the EU. I mean, that's something that Ursula von der Leyen alluded to, by the way, in her State of the Union speech last year. So I do propose that we try to front load as much as possible of all the goodies that come with EU membership to the Ukrainians as early as possible, instead of sort of following this very sort of technocratic box ticking approach to accession,
which could mean that it would take decades for the Ukrainians to be able to become members of the European Union.
And realistically, it would take a long time, of course. And there is also this sort of risk of sort of political uncertainty that is associated with that. I mean, you can see why some member states, all the member states, might not want to see the sort of political power diluted by another big country joining. And if you just look at the examples of Turkey and Western Balkans. Like, these are not success stories where this sort of, you know, the sort of technocratic approach, it worked well in Central and Eastern Europe, but it just failed us quite catastrophically, I would argue, in the case of Western Balkans and Turkey. I mean, we are now dealing with a Turkey that's far more uncooperative and a sort of problematic actor than ever before. And Western Balkans, I think, went through the sort of cycle of disappointed expectations and cynicism, and now we have leaders like Alexander Vučić in Serbia that's sort of trying to play the Europeans against the Russians, against the Chinese, and it's just not a sort of, you know, thriving part of the world as a result.
I guess one challenge I can see with this approach is take Ukraine. As an economist, I would be looking at sort of partial integration of Ukraine and go, okay, one of the things that we should not do is to include the Ukraine in the common agricultural policy and in a lot of the transfer programs, regional policy and whatever transfers money across the borders, because the Ukraine has such a high level of corruption. And you have an interesting section in your book, by the way, interesting and somewhat depressing, where you describe how many of these programs have increased corruption in Eastern European countries. But here's the challenge. I think the Ukrainians would want those programs, wouldn't they? So maybe it's hard to disentangle and unpackage the deal, because the Ukrainians will say, well, we'd like to join the internal market, but that will give you access to our large population for your goods, and we need some some help, some transfers in order to counterbalance that.
I mean, whatever happens will be a result of sort of bargains and compromises, and it is likely that, I mean, first of all, you know, the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine will involve transfers from, you know, the West to Ukraine. I mean, we should be just sort of realistic about it. Like, it is going to happen,
and it is going to increase corruption, probably.
You know, it will have all kinds of sort of second-order effects. You have to hope, and I think we have to sort of put in place policies that make it more likely for, you know, reforms to take place that are necessary to strengthen the rule of law and prevent the sort of backsliding that you see in places like Hungary and Poland, where, by the way, the problem is not simply the fact that there have been transfers that, you know, in the case of Hungary, the ruling party is sort of using to create a system of patronage and basically buy political support. But the problem really is that before the enlargement, there was a big emphasis on conditionality, on sort of meeting criteria and holding oneself to high standards. But that conditionality kind of disappeared with the accession. I mean, it's a little bit like getting into Harvard, right? Like, it's very hard to get in, but once you're in, like, you're probably not going to be kicked out. You're probably going to graduate. And I mean, we are in a the sort of piecemeal approach.
Same for professors. There's a Danish professor who says it's very hard to become a professor, but it's easy to be one.
I think that might very well be true. I mean, I know many tenured professors who I think seem to be having a fun time. So that's fair.
And it's hard to get into the EU, but as soon as you're there, we're sort of stuck with whatever they decide to do next.
So it might be helpful to have these sort of smaller conditionalities, right? And sort of, you know, carrots and sticks all along the road instead of just one big one. Is what I'm proposing. But I mean, the risk is there. I mean, the EU ultimately is a, you know, Europeans like to tell themselves that they are, you know, we are community based on sort of rules and laws, but in the end, I mean, there is no sort of deus ex machina to enforce those rules. I mean, the EU is not a super state. I mean, it has no coercive powers to speak of. I mean, it can impose fines that, you know, maybe member states could choose not to pay. We haven't really sort of run that experiment yet. But you know, the EU is not going to send people with guns if member states don't comply with EU law. I think that's a big difference between, you know, the US federal system and the European one. So
where this has actually happened, you mentioned in the book you've had US Marshals protecting federal law.
Of course,
in southern states, for instance, during
desegregation era. So we are, EU is a voluntary association of democratic, free countries. Some more democratic than others, it seems, sometimes, which is a challenge. But as such, it is. I think it is sort of misleading to think of it in the same terms as we think about the U.S. federal system, and thinking of sort of rule of law questions and enforcing common rules in the same way as we think about those things in a proper federal setting, because the EU is not a sort of properly designed federal state, so to speak.
So it is also a system where you can maybe be kicked out of something without being kicked out of something else. That's what you're meaning by, you said something like partial conditionality or something like that?
I mean, so we already see that with some of the EU funds being frozen for Hungary and Poland, and I think that is in a way a much overdue step, because for far too long those two governments were sort of getting away with sort of all kinds of transgressions, and I mean that is one of the sources of leverage that the European institutions do have, and I think they should be using that source of leverage. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking that it's somehow a sort of technical question, right? I mean, it's always a political call, and will always be a sort of political call, and whatever happens next will always involve sort of bargains and compromises between member states, and a form of sort of mutual accommodation of sorts.
And if I understand you correctly, that's also part of what you're saying in the book, that this sort of very sort of legalized idea, this idea that is all sort of a legal structure, it's all very legalized. That's a bit of a hoax. In reality, it's sovereign national states, nation states that at the end of the day do what they think is in their own national interest. During COVID, we saw that very clearly. You gave the example earlier, and that's the sort of thing that's always in the background. So
I mean, don't be sort of misunderstood and sort of suggest that it's EU rules are hoax. I mean, that's not really my claim. What I am saying is, and many of those rules are good ones. I mean, and ones that we need, particularly when it comes to the principle of non-discrimination in the internal market, for example, and rules around state aid and rules ensuring there is competition on the single market. But we should sort of remember that these rules are far more fragile than meets the eye. I mean, in the US there was a civil war fought over the sort of primacy of sort of federal law in a way over states' rights, if you will. We thankfully haven't had a European version of such a civil war, but the sort of supremacy of EU law is sort of assumed and sometimes sort of asserted, but it is not necessarily so. I mean, in reality, I mean, the ECJ rulings sort of start from the assumption that the ECJ has the sort of ultimate authority on these sort of constitutional level questions, but that's not necessarily the view of national constitutional courts. And sometimes these two worlds collide. They collide when the German federal court pushes back, and they also collided last in 2021 when the Polish Constitutional Tribunal basically told the EU institutions to get lost when it tried to sort of discipline Poland over its reforms of the judiciary. And there is no sort of easy fix to this problem. I mean, this is sort of permanent bug of the European architecture.
This is where the mechanism sort of ends. After that, it's not a mechanism anymore. It's okay. What do we do now? And that's when politics starts.
And I think exactly. So it's something we just have to sort of keep in the back of our minds, that this is part of the European condition.
So you mentioned two specific policy areas towards the end of the book as examples of how this thinking could work in sort of more concrete terms. Could you just briefly talk about those? It's energy policy and it's immigration. I think you've been mentioning the Schengen immigration a little bit, but maybe you could start with the immigration.
So both of these policy areas have the characteristic that there are sort of external effects from decisions taken by member states on others, and also that member states have very sort of different preferences over what exact sort of shape and form these policies ought to have, and that makes energy and immigration and number of other sort of policy issues at the European level kind of what some people call wicked problems, ones that don't really have sort of easy closed form solutions, but rather require sort of constant management and back and forth and mutual accommodation. It would be maybe it would be preferable if everybody sort of looked at the issue of immigration and energy through the same sets of lenses and arrived at the same conclusions. But if they don't, I mean, the question is, is let's say Schengen sustainable or not? What I propose is a system that, I mean, is first of all very modest in its ambitions. Does not sort of purport to sort of fix the problem once and for all, but provides an opportunity to actually sort of mitigate some of the pressure that was, let's say, put on European sort of asylum immigration systems in 2015, 2016. Instead of the Commission back then talked about mandatory quotas for countries to sort of accommodate given number of asylum seekers. That idea was adopted by a qualified majority, and then number of Central European countries just refused to implement it. So rather than have a sort of mandatory system that is ignored, it would be preferable to have a voluntary system in which not everybody would have to participate, but where countries that would be more keen to accommodate asylum seekers could sort of express their willingness to do so, and there would be a sort of matching system that would allocate asylum seekers and sort of countries where they could move, while sort of bypassing the sort of more difficult players that back in 2015, 2016 really contributed to an effective deadlock. I mean, again, not the silver bullet, but a sort of two-side matching system, as economists call it, could really sort of alleviate the pressure both on the sort of frontline countries, where Greece and Italy were in a position by virtue of their geography, by virtue of being on the external border of the EU, of being sort of overrun with refugees, and also alleviate, reduce the need for the sort of chaotic secondary migration that we saw, which was driven by the fact that people under Dublin rules were meant to stay in the sort of first country of entry, but that was not necessarily what they wanted. So that's
how do you make sure they actually do?
Well, it's you have to make a system that's incentive compatible, right?
Yes,
like that sort of gives make sure that people sort of end up plus minus in the country that they want to go to, and we just Dublin was not that system, and system of mandatory quotas was not that system, but a system of sort of two-sided matching, which I sort of look at in the book. I mean, it's not my idea; it's an idea advanced by the economist at Oxford, Alexander Teitelbaum, and Will Jones, who's a political scientist at I think now at Queen Mary University of London, and it's been used as a regional level in the UK, for example, quite successfully, to sort of get people to where they can have a life rather than sort of move asylum seekers around the country on a sort of semi-random basis, which has long been the default. On energy,
I guess it's easier for people to integrate and find a job, etc. If they're able to move to a place where they know that their skills are needed, or for instance, where they know people who could help them find a job.
So that's part of the story. I mean, it's a sort of two-sided problem. So, first of all, countries have sort of different needs, different skill sets that they sort of want to attract. They might have preferences over language skills, over education. Although obviously everybody wants the most educated migrants to themselves. And on the other side of the ledger, I mean, the asylum seekers know where they want to go, where they don't want to go, where they'll be treated well, or where they expect not to be treated so well, and in a way, just like there's a similar sort of matching system that allocates doctors to hospitals in the United States when they go on sort of their internships, or kidneys to patients based on a sort of set of criteria. In the same way, you can sort of, in principle, think about.
It's kind of a pseudo market.
It's kind of a pseudo market.
It's an allocation mechanism.
But I would argue that it's sort of preferable to no mechanism at all.
Yeah.
Which is what de facto currently exists, and it's also preferable to the more heavy-handed mechanisms that were sort of that European institutions in particular try to introduce and fail. Now when it comes to energy, I mean, the idea is a very simple one, which is that the best way to sort of cope with Europe's diversity in terms of energy policies is to have an as integrated energy market as possible, one in which there are plenty of interconnectors between countries, in which sort of energy is traded as freely as possible, in which there is competition, where the sort of coercive practices that especially the Russians pursued in Europe, which were then effectively outlawed, just are impossible. And it has to be said, Europe has made a lot of progress on that front over the recent years. And I would like to see much more emphasis on that, as opposed to...
What is lacking, sorry for interrupting, what is lacking in the current system compared to what you're just describing? To what extent doesn't it live up to that?
What worries me is, especially sort of post 2020, the level of sort of micromanagement almost of under the banner of sort of the green transition, which tries. I mean, I think it's a worthy goal, and we need to decarbonize. But it would be much preferable.
Everybody has to say that whenever we discuss it.
But it's far preferable to sort of set broad parameters of where we want to get, and then let innovation and markets play out, rather than sort of pick winners in advance and sort of focus on particular industries and shower them with money in a way that's distortionary to competition. I would argue that you need this also. I mean, there are many sort of considerations to balance, including questions of sort of energy security, and again having a sort of competitive, diversified, and sort of interconnected system is an important part of the sort of success of that endeavor.
Okay, I think we have your thinking sort of presented now, and that's a time for maybe opening up to the floor. If there are any questions, you're most welcome to take the floor, and be aware that we're recording this. It'll be on YouTube. It'll be on podcast. So if you don't want that to happen to whatever you want to say, then don't say it. And also do present your name and be brief. So I will continue asking questions until somebody makes a sign that he wants to ask a question. And let's talk a little bit about subsidiarity. Because you have an interesting section, and when I read that, I thought, "Gee, yes, subsidiarity. What happened to that?"
Yep. Yep.
What did happen to subsidiarity?
So first of all, subsidiarity is this idea from Catholic social teaching, late 19th century, that power should be exercised as closely to the people as possible, in a way. That there is sort of almost an organic hierarchy in which things need to be addressed at the lowest possible level, consistent with addressing them effectively. That you create a sort of higher and higher sort of layers of governance only to fix problems that can't be fixed at the lower level and to do nothing else. And I mean, by that standard, I mean the EU does many things that are not justified by sort of this sort of abstract view of subsidiarity.
And there's hardly any debate about that at all, even though subsidiarity is in the treaty.
Subsidiarity is in the treaty in a very particular way, not as a kind of binding constraint on what the EU can do, but rather as a guiding principle together with the principle of proportionality for the EU's exercise of the so-called shared competences, in which the EU can act but doesn't have to act, and as a result, I mean, there is sort of need for, whenever there is sort of new EU legislation in those areas, for the EU to justify that it actually is sort of acting in a sort of proportional and subsidiary manner. The trouble is that there had never really been sort of legal challenges on subsidiarity ground that were successful. I think there were maybe one or two cases where the proportionality principle was sort of used to strike down European legislation. I think there's a case I discuss in the book, but it doesn't come back to the front of my mind for some reason. I mean, it's it plays more of a sort of political role that, yet, as you say, it's not sort of invoked very frequently.
But you also mentioned in the book that there is a way that national parliaments can invoke it.
I mean, that's the sort of system of yellow and is it orange or red cards that they can sort of try to sort of stop European legislation in the
so
making.
If a third of parliaments say to the Commission, wait a minute, how does this comply with subsidiarity? The Commission has to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, but when you think about that, like, that's not all that different from just having a sort of intergovernmental element of the decision making. I mean, these parliaments are not that different from the sort of government representatives in the council. Like, if
True.
I mean, you can say it's an added layer of protection. I mean, it just hasn't been terribly sort of effective in its own right in sort of stopping.
Apparently, it's been used 3 times or something like that. There you go.
Thank you. My name is Henrik Dahl. I am a member of Parliament for the Liberal Alliance. My question is about strategic autonomy, and I would like you to share your thoughts on strategic autonomy. And I would also like to motivate my question. I am the vice chairman of the parliamentary agency that oversees foreign policy. So I happen to know that its strategic autonomy is on the agenda of every meeting in the Council of Ministers these days. And rightfully so, I think, because Nord Stream 2 was a wake-up call, and we don't want to get into a Nord Stream 2 situation again. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine strategic autonomy without more state intervention. How will you carry it out in practice without the state intervening? And a number of parties, including my own party and other parties in Europe, are not too happy about more state intervention. But we are happy about strategic autonomy. Do you have any suggestions for how to solve this problem?
So my thoughts on strategic autonomy are very simple. I hate the term, and I would advocate like retiring it from public debate altogether, because it means different things to different people, and it's I think deliberately very ambiguous. I mean, when you look at it just from a sort of purely sort of security strategic standpoint, it can either mean that Europeans should do more on defense, on sort of on security, increase defense budgets, improve procurement on defense, etc. Like, to me, those are straightforward propositions that are true, and of course Europeans should do more. But it also can mean to other people that Europeans should do more and independently of the United States in a way that could even sort of sever the defense cooperation with the United States in a number of areas. For example, by putting in place a sort of more protectionist parochial approach towards defense procurement. And that to me not only is, like, in my view, a bad idea, but it's an idea that's just not going to fly in much of Central and Eastern Europe, or even in a country like Denmark, I would assume. So my preference, even talking narrowly about sort of defense and security, is to just, instead of talking about strategic autonomy, to sort of talk about specific policies that we need. And I think like PESCO is actually I think a very good platform for doing that, because it sort of offers exactly the sort of flexibility I
Tell us what PESCO is.
That's the permanent structured cooperation in the area of defense that the EU has, and it's there is a small defense fund that comes with it, and it sort of enables countries with some support from European institutions to sort of pursue projects together. A battle group. Some countries are developing a European helicopter, European drone, sort of projects that can be sort of pursued under EU auspices, but with countries firmly in the driver's seat of doing things that they think that they add value to them, or where they can leverage their sort of comparative advantage, so to speak. So I think that's a helpful way forward. In addition to that, I mean, there's it's a matter for sort of national level debate about like how much are you spending on defense, what are you doing with your armed forces. I don't think the EU. There are those who sort of entertain the idea of having a European army. I don't think that idea is going to fly either. There's no way in the world national governments are going to give up control over hard power and hand it over to Brussels. So I think that's
maybe defense an area where your idea of decentral coalitions of different countries having common interests in certain things would work well. I mean, now Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and it would make a lot of sense for the Nordic countries to get together, cooperating on defense. It might be easier for us to do that in some areas than for the whole of the EU to decide to do that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, and you already see some of that happening already. But I mean, the critical question on defense is that, like, we need to spend more money and build up capacities which have been sort of geared towards peacetime, and we might not be entering necessarily an era of peacetime for a while now. And also, just a sort of quick sort of side point on this, obviously strategic autonomy or sovereignty, European sovereignty, as President Macron likes to talk about it, also extends to things like trade and sort of regulatory practices. We now see in the EU a sort of proliferation of different anti-coercion instruments to address various Chinese misbehaviors in sort of the area of trade. I'm very wary of that. I think like at the European level, what we really need is to sort of keep those four freedoms in mind, and having European institutions to sort of preserve those and deepen those, and I don't want to see those compromised. And very often, this idea of strategic autonomy is just sort of used as an excuse, as a banner under which like really bad economic policies are pursued at the European level. And
so there's always been political excuses for protectionism for people who want to be protected from competition, and this is a new one. So fencing it in to the areas where it does make sense is one of the challenges. So there might be a microchip issue, there might be an issue concerning certain defense products, but we don't want this to sort of spread out to all kinds of areas as a new type of protectionism. And
also in this context, what worries me is just the sheer parochialism of this, that you have a European Chips Act, you have an American Chips Act, you have the Inflation Reduction Act that gives subsidy to US electric vehicle producers. and then the EU responds in kind, and it aggravates the transatlantic partnership, but it also I think sort of willfully neglects the fact that actually US and European interests in many of these areas are aligned, right? Like, so US interests are not threatened by microchips being manufactured in Europe. They are threatened by the prospect of China swallowing Taiwan, and you can sort of address that concern by policies that maybe move more of the chips manufacturing away from Taiwan, but in a sort of way that does not discriminate between, say, US and European producers, and I think you'll achieve much greater gains from trade, and also can sort of showcase that the transatlantic relationship is not dead yet. So that's the sort of argument I'm making both in Washington and in Brussels when I occasionally visit.
Okay, now we take 2 questions in a row. So please, don't answer the first one until you had the second one, and maybe write down what the first one is about. Yes.
Otto Bruns Petersen. I was wondering whether what we are seeing in the Ukraine crisis is not an example of what you're advocating. I mean, the response it's been, of course, sanctions were imposed centrally in the EU with some difficulty, but the military aid for Ukraine has been sort of decentralized, and member countries have contributed very differently according to their national preferences. So is this already happening?
I think that in that area it is certainly happening.
You're not listening to what I'm saying, are
sorry.
you?
My bad.
My name is Frede Vestergaard. I'm a journalist. I would like to hear your opinion about the fund, the Next Generation EU fund of 750 billion euro. It appears to me that it gives the Commission quite some power in distributing this big amount of money, of which I think actually Italy and Spain they are supposed to receive 40% of it. And actually, it is interesting, I think, that Denmark is also it's a sort of, it could be seen as a sort of fiscal policy through the back door in the Euro system. But also the countries which are not members of the Euro system, including Denmark, stand as they guarantee this loan. Do you think this is the last time it's been raised, or will the Commission go on with this in the future also?
Great question. So I'll start with the second one. I share your concern insofar as I really do not like that sort of dirigist micromanaging sort of aspect of Next Generation EU, where governments submit plans and plans are sort of technocratically evaluated, and then the money is dispersed. I also dislike the fact that from a package that you would expect to be focused primarily on European level public goods, I mean, a lot of the stuff that's going to be spent on are much more localized public goods. I mean, I would like to spend EU money on research and development, on genuine sort of European infrastructure, not on sort of local, overwhelmingly sort of local and national sort of public goods. So that is a concern. At the same time, I would not exaggerate the importance of it in macroeconomic terms. I mean, it's 700 billion. Sounds like a lot of money. I mean, it's a very modest sum in sort of macroeconomic terms, spread over a 7-year horizon, and in itself, I mean, you can say it is a form of fiscal policy, but it's and we can wonder how much of the money will be sort of wasted or spent on things that the EU shouldn't be spending money on. To what extent it serves as a transfer to certain governments. But I mean, it's not that much money. I mean, in this sort of grander scheme of things. The question is whether the debt instrument might be used again in a situation in which a Eurozone country gets into, a fiscal crisis of the sort we saw, around 2010, 2011 in the Eurozone, because the European Central Bank's sort of space for maneuvering is much smaller in an age where you have much higher inflation rates, where the ECB has to sort of maintain its credibility. It might not be well positioned to just buy, big sort of chunks of public debt across the Eurozone's periphery. And I think there will be calls if we indeed see a fiscal crisis to use this sort of debt instrument again to somehow federalize part of. I mean, it's an ongoing conversation that we sort of keep having at every turn, really. So whether it's going to be used again, I think it's very much an open question. I mean, I don't have a sort of crystal ball to tell you that. I think also you're exactly right about what you say, with the caveat that these arms transfers are not necessarily covered by EU law or policy making. So I mean, it's a de facto example of sort of polycentrism in action and sort of decentralized initiative by member states. I would just say that it's a situation which is, to me, infinitely preferable to a world of strategic autonomy where we would have to make collective decisions at EU27 about transferring sort of arms and weapons to Ukraine. I mean, the fact that some countries were able to act quickly, get the assistance out of the door, in the first days of war. I mean, that did matter, and that's true both of obviously the US, UK, but also of European countries that sort of stepped up and helped. And if we had to have that approved at every turn by Mr. Orban, I think we would be and the Ukrainians themselves would be in deep trouble.
So you introduced the term polycentricity here. Could you speak a little bit about that? Maybe Elinor Ostrom, that you write about in the book. What is that?
So the idea of polycentricity is one in which you have sort of a self-governing system, if you will, in which there are multiple centers of autonomous decision-making that kind of interact with each other. And Elinor Ostrom was a famous American political scientist, received the Nobel Prize in economics for her research on how such polycentric orders sort of emerge and are sustained, and what are the sort of conditions of success for such orders to be sustained. And I mean, her work was very applied, and she wrote a couple of papers about sort of polycentricity at the sort of international, transnational level, but the sort of bulk of her research concerned management of natural resources by sort of small communities, by how lobster farmers and you do farm lobsters, and anyway, so fishing communities in Maine, like how they sort of manage lobster population and prevent sort of overfishing and how kind of informal arrangements basically emerge in some of these settings. She also looked at examples from developing countries, irrigation and water management in places like Malaysia and Africa. This was many years ago, obviously, and she came up with kind of like a very empirically driven sort of observations about what makes these systems work and how creative really people are in sort of self-organizing in situations where you sort of.
And how does her work apply to the European Union?
Well, the European Union is in a sort of de facto similar situation in which she describes settings where you would expect maybe sort of central governments to step in and put in place regulations for how fish populations can be sort of kept stable, and in fact people sort of devise these systems themselves collectively. without external enforcement. And the EU is in a similar state in which, I mean, there is a sort of common governance arrangement under the EU, but it doesn't really have a sort of very strong center of power that can enforce rules. So you have to think about ways how member states make arrangements between themselves that are sort of sustainable and incentive compatible in different areas of policy making. And I think there are sort of lessons from the sort of micro world that she is working on to the sort of macro world of sort of international institutions. Because in the world of international institutions, we don't really have a sort of top-level enforcer of rules. And I think that's true of the EU, and it's true of just international organizations and international institutions more broadly.
Okay, we'll take another question.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Pindrup. I'm a candidate locally with a political party that is nationalistic and liberalistic, called Nye Borgerlige, and translates poorly into English. I've got a question on, you mentioned quickly this conflict, inherent conflict on the state of law, i.e. state versus union. Do you see a need to consolidate the positions there to solve that, or is it okay to leave it as is and as a bit of a loose, if you will?
I mean, I think it is a genuine challenge, in the sense that the EU is supposed to be a sort of association of free democratic member states, and really my sort of observation about Hungary, which I mean is a country that's very close to my heart and I love it dearly, is that it no longer has a competitive political system. It has a highly concentrated media ownership, very sort of unusual arrangement where basically most outlets are owned by a foundation or controlled by the ruling party. Where I mean, it's very hard to imagine opposition being able to compete in elections. I mean, the opposition is sort of hopeless in they're hopeless in their own way, and they have they can sort of blame themselves for lots of things. But I mean, the way the electoral law was written it makes it just very, very hard, objectively speaking, to compete. I think it's a real challenge to the future of the EU. I mean, the question is, what do you do about it? It's not a sort of technical exercise. It requires political judgment, and I'm not sure we are seeing enough of that. Partly because, and that is sort of the characteristic of the sort of post-2016 era. The question of what liberal democracy is gets conflated with a sort of much wider array of progressive causes, whereby Viktor Orban gets criticized, for his position on migration, abortion, same-sex marriage, etc., rather than being criticized more narrowly for incumbent entrenchment and sort of eroding checks and balances. And I think that really sort of dilutes the effectiveness of that criticism, and also sort of narrows the coalition that can sort of push back against what's happening in a place like Hungary. So I mean, I do think it is a challenge. And I would also say that situations in Poland and Hungary are similar in some respects, but they're also different. I mean, Poland is a much bigger country where it's harder to consolidate power the way Viktor Orban has, where there is going to be an election in which the opposition has a chance at winning actually later this year, and so I think the approaches to these countries should be different, and that's why I'm sort of nervous by the sort of, again, the box ticking sort of technocratic approach to this that we are seeing. Also the fact that Viktor Orban is very clearly a sort of bad faith actor when it comes to Europe's security and foreign policy, whereas in Poland, by and large, has played a very constructive role, especially in the Ukraine situation.
Let's talk a little bit more about LGBT. You early in our conversation, you mentioned that part of diversity is different norms, and you just brought it up again now. In your book, you argue you use same-sex marriage and LGBT rights as an example of an area where maybe we should have a more decentralized approach. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
So first of all, just to put my cards on the table, I'm in favor of same-sex marriage. I have, no issue.
You're in favor of decarbonization and same-sex marriage.
No issue whatsoever.
You're a good person, right? Okay, we got it. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, I'm a very good person. Yes, I even recycle and never get speeding tickets. So it is true on the one hand that attitudes, public attitudes across the West, attitudes towards same-sex marriage underwent the dramatic change, probably the sort of single biggest sort of change measured in public opinion over the sort of shortest period of time. And you remember Senator Barack Obama being, against gay marriage and then being in favor of it, within the sort of scope of a couple of years, really following that shift in public attitudes. It is possible that we'll see a similar shift in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, but we might not. I mean, I think it's at the very least it's a possibility, and the question is, how do we treat the question in the context of Central and Eastern Europe if this divergence continues to exist? I don't think looking at it as kind of an aberration to be sort of somehow swept away by greater forces of history. I don't think that's a very useful strategy. And I think there is a sense in which Europeans and Americans, for that matter, have to accept that sometimes sort of national level democracy produces outcomes that they might not like, and especially when this issue gets sort of conflated with debates about the quality of democracy and checks and balances, I find that particularly unhelpful. And finally, I would ask the question of what's the role of the EU in all this? Since when is this question part of sort of the core of shared values that sort of everybody needs to maintain, as opposed to being a sort of matter to be determined by national policy making, which is what it is. So
we're back to subsidiarity there.
So back to subsidiarity. There is one dimension of the problem where you have to sort of, I guess, be sort of careful and nuanced in thinking through it, especially when it comes to recognizing same-sex marriages in different countries, right? There's a principle of non-discrimination which we want to apply, and that principle is in sort of tension with different countries having different sort of legal systems, and then you have sort of couples moving from one country to another, and do they get the same exact sort of legal recognition by virtue of having that legal partnership institutionalized in a different country? And I think that's a sort of a reasonable sort of gray area where sort of people can sort of disagree, and I think some form of sort of mutual accommodation has to be found.
Yes, and also I agree completely, and I guess part of the issue here is, I think you mentioned it briefly before, if there are there are certain things that I think most people in the world would want for their country. Mm-hmm. Less corruption, not being arrested in the street for no apparent reason without being put in front of a judge at some point within a specific and short period of time, stuff like that. I think maybe to some extent freedom to express your political opinions, maybe not to draw pictures of Muhammad or stuff like that, but so there's certain things that are close to being universal. Now this is not close to being universal at all, and most people in our part of the world didn't even believe in it if we go back a few decades. So it's a strange strategy to start there, to start with the stuff where you are not going to get a winning coalition of more or less everybody agreeing that yes, this is important parts of sort of liberal democracy and liberal institutions, that men should be able to marry each other. I mean, like you, I'm in favor of it, but that's not the issue here. Why should we tell Hungarians or you know, people in what was the country we had a football we had the World Championships in? I've just forgotten.
Qatar.
Dubai.
Qatar.
Qatar. You know, they have some serious human rights issue. Is this the central one? So it seems like an unwise approach to trying to achieve a betterment.
I mean, I think it is really unwise, especially in the following sense. I mean, in the sort of European context, let's sort of leave Qatar aside for a moment. Especially if you sort of care about, you know, the future of Hungary's democracy.
Yeah.
If you care about, you know, the Hungarian government's sort of behavior on foreign policy issues, then you want to focus on those questions alone, and you don't want to sort of bundle them together with much more divisive questions.
Yes.
Because then the coalition that is going to sort of try to hold Viktor Orban to account just gets smaller, which is the opposite of what you want to do. Yet, if you go back to 2018, there was this report done by European Parliament on sort of state of democracy in Hungary, and the sort of criticisms leveled against Viktor Orban's government were, I mean, to me, just so far-fetched. I mean, they included questions of you know, gender stereotypes being depicted in Hungarian elementary school textbooks. These criticisms included the fact that the Roma minority is being discriminated against in Hungary, which certainly is true, but the same can be said about Roma minorities in other EU countries, right? So in a way, I mean, it is really unhelpful to have a very sort of broad and expansive understanding of, you know, what liberal democracy is, as opposed to a much narrower one. And I think that's you know, true, even in the debates about, you know, democratic backsliding, real or imagined, in the United States, and the sort of polarizing effects of candidates like Donald Trump, and where people really
It's an overreach.
Sort of see policies that they don't like as attacks on democracy itself, and I think that is very dangerous. My good friend Shadi Hamid in Washington, who works at the Brookings Institution, has a great book out where he tackles this question in the context of particularly the Arab Spring and Arab sort of transitions, short-lived transitions towards democracy, where you had basically, you know, people in the West freak out when they realize that democracies can produce very illiberal, even bigoted outcomes, and he and I mean I share the belief that it's, you know, still worth being committed to the very narrow procedural idea of democracy, even if it generates results that we don't like. And it looks like the sort of, you know, number of people who are committed to that narrow procedural idea of democracy seems to be dwindling, and not just on the far right.
Okay. So you mentioned a couple of interesting papers during our conversation, and we'll of course link to those in the show notes of the podcast and on YouTube, etc. You also mentioned in the book that I'm not sure you're arguing that there's a link, but there has been a backlash on some of the LGBT. I'm having trouble with this. LGBT issues in some Eastern European countries. Are you arguing that that's because we've been pushing the issue, that there's been a backlash, or are you just observing it?
I think, you know, pushing the issue just generates unintended consequences that might not be to our liking. I'm thinking, you know, the current U.S. ambassador to Hungary, David Pressman, is a, you know, gay man who arrived in Hungary with his partner, and I suspect that the reason for his pick for this position was, you know, was also his sexual orientation, to sort of send a signal to the Orban government. And while I understand why it's being welcomed by, you know, Hungary's LGBTQ community, it also serves as a pretext for the Orban government to dismiss any criticism directed at it by Ambassador Pressman. I mean, I'm told by people that when he meets with the Hungarian government, they always sort of preface anything he says, well, you're here to, you know, promote, you know, LGBTQ agenda, right? And that's the sort of narrative you get from the Fidesz media. So I think as a matter of just prudence and strategy, I mean, it is sort of wise to, tread carefully along these questions which are polarizing in some parts of Europe, whether it is, access to abortion or gay rights, or various sort of forms of policies and behaviors, sometimes officially sanctioned, that people in Denmark might rightly consider bigoted.
Okay. Dalibor Rohatch, thank you very much for joining us.
Martin, thank you so much.
It was a great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you.
And do have a look at the book and buy a copy. 450 kroner. It's 700 on Amazon, so it's a great bargain. You'll be saving 250 kroner. Imagine what you can buy for 250 kroner.
Yep.
Thank you very much for joining us. It was a great debate we had. Join us again some other time. Thanks.